We got a great show for you guys today. We're going to talk about Mike Thomas's move to injured reserve and the possibility of what the future holds for him with the New Orleans Saints. We are going to talk about what the team needs to do to win Monday night against the Baltimore Ravens. And ESPN's Field Yates joins us to break down everything about the team, the national view, what people think about Dennis Allen, Andy versus Jameis, and much, much more, including what the future holds for this team in terms of its cap situation. Another episode of the NewOrleans.Football podcast coming to you from the Better Call Botto podcast studio. If you need help with car wrecks, offshore injuries, Maritime Jones Act, hurricane and storm claims, you better call Botto at 504-323-7777 or 985-303-7777. Hit those sevens if you need help with any of that stuff. Get your free consultation and case review, bottolaw.com. And check out our friends, Firehouse Subs, Veterans Boulevard locations. Great people doing great things for the community. We have an event coming up there in December, so keep an eye out for information on that. Another episode of the podcast. Let's go. Hey, welcome back, everybody. Nick Unreal here with Mike Triplett. And the big news, obviously, and we're going to get right into it. No beating around the bush. Mike Thomas placed on injured reserve yesterday. Dennis Allen said he believes it to be a season-ending injury, which I think, if, just practically speaking, 3 years of this, 12 healthy games played, including playoffs, going to be 30 years old, set to make a lot of money, 28 million against the cap, 15-16 million dollars in salary. Does the reality of the situation change one way or another?
Yeah, I mean, you gotta wonder if he's played his last snap with the Saints. And it was that last number that you meant. Look, there's no getting out of the fact that they're going to take a big salary cap hit. That's the way they do business. They pushed all the dead money back on his contract. It's the same for all the healthy players who are playing great right now. Like, the same for Marshawn Lattimore's big deal. The same for Ryan Ramchek's big deal. All the dead money will come later. You can't escape that. So what they have to decide next year is, do they want to pay him another $16.5 million that he is due in 2023? And I got to believe there's no way he plays under that contract as currently structured. I think if they do decide they want to try to bring him back, I think it's got to be a pay cut, or it's got to be, can we convert that stuff into incentives? But it's quite possible. Look, we've talked there with their salary cap situation. There's some players they're not going to be able to pay next year anyway, and he's starting to feel like a prime candidate for the guy that moves on. Now, you would hate for someone else to get the incentive laden Mike base value $5 million up to $20 million if he hits all these incentives, and then watch him finally bloom. But um, I'd say the odds favor him not playing another game with the Saints right
Yeah, just give him where he's at and how long you've kind of went through this situation. And if you are paying a guy a $15.5 million base salary, that has to come with some type of guarantee at this point, where they're at in the cap, how tight they are against it, waiting multiple years for this payoff that hasn't come. If you're allocating that much money, you got to know, all right, this guy's going to give us this. And with Mike right now, you look at him, you don't know what he's going to give you. And that's not a knock on Mike Thomas. There's nobody that probably believes in this guy's talent more than me. Like I believed he was going to come back and be the same guy. We saw signs of that during the offseason. We saw signs of it early in the season. And there's a piece of me that believes he's going to come back from this, be 30 years old, and be one of the better wide receivers in the NFL. But I can't place a bet on that. This year, I would have placed a bet on it. You tell me another thing has happened. It's another setback. It's not just about the production now. Like, is something else going to happen? And now that he gets into his 30s, are these other injuries going to come? And how does he react to them? How does his body react to them? Is there going to be more of this going on? And at this point, it's just hard to say, okay, we're just going to leave it alone and just hope and pray that everything goes forward as it must. And the thing is about just keeping him on this contract. I don't think you can do that and just leave it alone. Like, if you keep him on the team, you're restructuring this 15.5 million. You're pushing it down the road. You're putting more money on your future cap. And if you aren't getting the production, you're just creating a debt. And if there's no payoff for anything, run up the credit card and have some fun. When you're paying that bill, you can still look back on the fun. Like there's nothing there right now if things go wrong again. So it's too much for me to do. I think if they do keep him around, obviously June 2nd would be the date. If you cut him, he'd be designated for that. You get $11 million back. If you trade him, I think he would stay on your roster until that date, and then you trade him, and then you get some relief. That doesn't help you in the first wave of free agency, though. So it is a tough situation. You do have to pay this bill one way or another, but there can be some, okay, we got rid of him on June 2nd. Now we sign the draft class. Now we sign whoever 2023's Tyrann Mathieu is. But yeah, it's an extremely difficult situation. And I don't think it can go on as currently constructed.
Yeah, I mean, those numbers you were just saying, if it's hard to follow, I mean, just go back and read an article how we described what they did when Drew Brees retired.
Yeah.
Like it was,
We got a breakdown on
yeah,
the site right now too.
yeah. I mean, this is what it looks like from March 1st till June 1st, even if the guy's not on the team. That's what they're going to have to do. That's how big the size of his contract was. I don't think they have to cut him though, just because like I think we can eliminate some of the, he doesn't want to be here, he was refusing to play, like that kind of stuff. I think it was important that we actually saw him on the sideline being as engaged as anyone else while the defense was making a big play the other day. But I mean, it's just a football decision at this point, a football and a financial decision at this point that's going to make it really tough to keep him around.
Yeah, make sure you do check out NewOrleans.Football. We got a story on there breaking down all this stuff, how all the money works, how the cap situations work. And there is one super creative wild card situation that they could play out to cut this number down significantly to lower future charges. If anyone were to get that done, it would be the Saints because they do the craziest stuff and they pull stuff out. But you got to check out the site to read it. And that happens to also be the best way to support us. Get an extra bonus podcast every week, all of our analysis, everything we write, and you like the show, you'll like the website.
All right, let me ask you this though. 2022 Saints. I think this was the most optimistic week they've had all season. Well, at least since the Atlanta win in week 1. How much does this take the wind out of the sails?
I don't know if the wind was already out of the sails. So we aren't there wasn't wind and it dropped. Like there was the Mike Thomas wind has been gone. So I don't know if it really changes the feel of the situation. We've seen them succeed on offense quite a bit without him. I think they're doing pretty good on that side of the ball, averaging like 30 points per game in the Dalton era. Interceptions have been an issue, but that's not a Mike Thomas with or without really situation there. Um, so yeah, I don't know if it changes the initial feel. I think if you do look down the road for me, Mike Thomas does matter. He's an extremely good football player. Like I said, I think the world of his ability and his talents, and I think he is a difference maker. I think he makes a difference in the red zone, but it just feels like they've already figured it out. So it doesn't feel like a major thing that changes their immediate future or feel. I think I've already reconciled kind of what they are without him. And I was looking at him like, if you sprinkle Mike on top, this is what happens.
Right.
Whereas last year or the year before with Mike, every time I was like, wait for Mike to get back. This is what it'll be with him. This is what it'll be with him. I think they're doing a good enough job on offense, and the reality kind of already exists without him. So I don't know if it changes my conversations about the team now, but I do believe that he would have made a difference at some point if he had come back and played well.
Right. It lowers their ceiling probably
Yeah.
more than their last year the floor dropped out on them when they lost Michael Thomas. They had no other answers. This year they have they figured out how to make Alvin Kamara the featured guy in the passing game again. Obviously Andy Dalton has a lot to do with that. And Chris Olave. I mean, thank God they made that trade. I mean, any second guessing of that trade now, he just became maybe the most important guy on the team. A case could be made for Marshawn Lattimore as well, among others. But I agree. I think this offense can still be good enough to win without Michael Thomas. Obviously, it would have been better with Michael Thomas, but I don't think I'm going to change my win-loss prediction based on it. I mean, maybe you could have dreams more of how special they could have been if they made a playoff run, if everybody was going to be back healthy. But I think they can continue to make the gains they've made on offense, and getting Jarvis Landry back would help too.
You're the GM. You're calling
Yeah.
Andrew Kessler to find out what goes forward with Mike. What do you do?
Well, look, I don't know what the relationship is like. I don't think this added any animosity to the relationship. I think they're on the same page. It sure seems like that has been a big thing that they both worked toward all year long. So if they're both on the same page and Michael Thomas has realized his new reality after he had this surgery that he is going to have to sign a heavy incentive-laden contract next year that only pays a small base and he gets everything else if he's healthy, then it's possible you keep him and you sign with that deal and you're the team that gets the payoff if that happens. But he can't stay at his current rate. It's a contract you have to move on from if there's not going to be a pay cut or changing that money to incentive.
I would go, I think 5 feels like the right number, but I respect him too much. He's part of my
Yeah.
team. If I'm Mickey Loomis, I maybe say, "Okay, 8, we'll give you $8 million of this."
Get half of it and you can get the
Yeah,
other half
the other
if you
7.5.
reach just no games played almost. It does,
Games
yeah.
played, yards, whatever, and then that becomes for, the people that like the cap, unlikely to be earned. It doesn't count against your cap right away, so you're lowering and creating some space. His cap number comes down from 28 million to 21, and that's a little bit of breathing room there, and that would have to be the way you do it. I can't leave him at 15.5. Now, if Mike says no to that, then you go to plan B. Okay, can I trade him? Okay, what's his value? People know that you're gonna have to cut him probably if you're trying to trade him, so I don't know if he has any value at all. They'll wait you out and then sign him. If I'm Mike, I think that's where it becomes very interesting because A, you can come back here and you can play in a system you're comfortable with. You're hitting the ground running, you're regaining your value, and then you're hitting the market and getting that contract. But your quarterback's Andy Dalton or somebody else next year, or Jameis
It's
Winston.
possible Mike will want to move on
Yeah, that's
too.
what
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think he could very easily convince himself to say, "I fit better with this offense." Oh, Sean Payton has Justin Herbert? Maybe that's a good spot for me. You know what I mean? Like, he could decide to make a decision like that. So I think it's definitely possible that maybe Mike wants to change of scenery, and I don't think it's a personal thing. I truly believe that, like, there was a mending of fences. He was in a good place mentally. He was on the sideline in the last game. I don't think that there's any turmoil this time. A year ago, I felt like I was I was surprised they fixed it to the point that he was back in camp this year. I thought there was enough turmoil that it was possible. I don't think there's turmoil now. I think it's probably just to the point where both sides kind of feel like, all right, this thing has hit a point and it's changing one way or the other, but how we've been, our reality no longer exists.
Well, I know you were asking earlier too. I mean, one of the hot topics is whether it was mismanaged, and that's another thing we don't completely know. But I think a lot of this is how Michael Thomas has learned to treat his injury treatments because he did try to play through the last injury a few years ago, and that ended up backfiring on him, or at least he feels it did because of how much time he ended up missing an entire season after that, after he could never get that ankle right. He made it very clear this offseason that doctors don't always right. Every different doctor will give you a different opinion. He's not just going to, take the team doctor's word for it. But I think both sides I think he bought in and the team believed that this was the kind of injury that he could have played through, or could have rested and rehabbed and then played through. And if you take what Dennis Allen said, I know a lot of people have trouble taking injury news from the coach, especially when it comes to Michael Thomas. But he said they had a recent MRI and they just weren't seeing the growth and the development that they were hoping to see and needed to see, and that's when they decided to have surgery. So, I I think when they didn't place him on IR, when they said it could be 2 to 3 to 4 weeks, I think there was a hope that that was the possibility, and it was worth it to pursue that hope. But I don't think this was "Oh, they just discovered he had a dislocated toe," or like, rampant mismanagement or anything like that.
Yeah, there are a couple things here. One, like even behind the scenes, whether you believe DA on injuries or not anymore, like I'm not telling you what to believe or not. I believe on this one he was telling what his truth was, what the team's truth was, what everybody's truth was at the point. And behind the scenes, non-DA people were even voicing optimism about him eventually getting back out there. And it's like, yeah, it's getting there, it's going, it's just a couple more hurdles, you know. But from a Mike Thomas standpoint, I find it very hard to criticize him for not taking last year's Will Lutz approach where something happens and immediately, you know what, I'm not doing any of this. Just let's go get surgery and then we start the rehab after that. If you're Mike Thomas and you had a botched surgery and someone tells you that you can rehab this injury and be fine, but if it's going to take, 2 to 4 weeks, you're going to probably go the 2 to 4 weeks because you just lost your whole career in its prime because you had a botched surgery. So if you're telling Mike, okay, you can rehab it and then you're going to be fine, no surgery. If I'm Mike Thomas, I'm going that route first, and then if it doesn't work, then you get surgery. I think it's extremely logical. You remove emotion from the equation. I think it's very easy to understand how he ended up at that place. What's frustrating for me is that we're just not watching a guy that should be on the path to Canton. I
Yeah,
mean, quite possibly one of the best 3, 4 wide receivers of his generation. Never gets to build on that. We don't see his prime. We don't get to watch him enjoy playing football. I think everybody loses here because him not being on the field is a hit to the football analysts sitting here, the fans watching this, to football at large. We should be celebrating this guy and watching him ascend and having him continue to prove that he's truly quarterback agnostic, I guess is the word. Like, it didn't matter
true.
who was throwing the ball to him. Like, he was gonna dominate. He'd be doing that. And I think he would be making the case right now for, putting his name right next to Jerry Rice. Like, I think he was that type of talent, and we don't get to see it, and, it sucks. Like, it sucks that we don't get to enjoy that part of his career.
No, and I mean, at a time when the Saints were competitive too. I mean, he could have been what put them over the top in Drew Brees' last season.
Yeah.
So it's all just it's a shame, whether you want to point fingers or think it was a bad investment. It's definitely a shame.
Yeah, and look, the one conversation that I think nobody should be having is, should they have signed him to that contract? He had 3 outstanding years. He earned the deal. He had the best season in receiver history after he signed it. It went bad, clearly,
Yeah,
and I think, looking back, it's like, man, wouldn't that, wish that wouldn't have happened, but there was no way you could not have signed him,
I don't remember a single voice, and usually usually you'll find somebody who takes the contrarian opinion. I don't remember anyone suggesting they shouldn't have signed him to that deal at the time that they
and
signed
he and if he was playing right now and was performing like he was early in the season, 20 million a year would look cheap because the contracts
it.
at
It's
that
Christian
position,
Kirk money right
it is, the contracts have went crazy. We're gonna bring in Field Yates now, ESPN analyst. Great interview going over just everything with the Saints. Make sure you follow him at Field Yates on Twitter and check him out. Just turn on ESPN. If Stephen A. Smith isn't on, Field's probably on the TV somewhere. All right, welcoming in Field Yates on the Desi Vega guest line. Check them out, St. Charles Avenue location, best steaks in the city. And we have, for my money, maybe one of the best analysts in the country on the show today. Field Yates from ESPN. Field, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. First of all, it's an honor. As I joked, because I may have heard about the eventual arrival of Trip to NewOrleans.Football. This was the Shaq and Kobe. I made that joke first. I want to make it very clear that I was the first person to independently text each one of you that Shaq and Kobe were reunited on the Saints beat. So it's awesome to see both of you and catch up with you guys, and obviously love what you guys are doing. And I know that Saints fans are truly spoiled to have your coverage around the clock.
Well, that was gonna be my first question, was tell us how great we are, so I guess we can move on to
Okay.
the feeling is mutual, though. We both I got to work with Field at ESPN, Nick got to work in the Boston market with Field, and, for somebody who's one of the fastest risers in the business, no ego whatsoever. He's been, awesome and very supportive of us. Thanks for joining us. Look, you wear every hat at ESPN. We're gonna get into some salary cap stuff because I know you have a lot of background in that. And just national analyzing the league, but obviously you do a lot of fantasy as well. So the first question has to be, how much has Taysom Hill ruined your life? Both trying to figure out what position he plays, but also trying to figure out where to rank him every week, whether to use him on your own teams.
It's funny because the ranking part now just feels so insignificant compared to the time in which, and for those that don't play fantasy or aren't as familiar with how we have to make these decisions, going into the season, was it 3 years ago? I think it was. We had Taysom Hill. We made a decision to designate him as a tight end because obviously he plays so many different roles. It's hard to say specifically what you would call him, but I think on the Saints website now, he's technically listed as a tight end as well. So we made the decision to call him a tight end. Our rules at ESPN are that whatever position a player begins the season at, you can add eligibility elsewhere, but you can't remove a player's position. So if a guy starts at wide receiver, you can make him a running back too, like Cordarrelle Patterson, but you can't take away the wide receiver designation. Then all of a sudden, Taysom Hill becomes a starting quarterback for the Saints and starting quarterback has much more fantasy upside than a starting tight end who's not named Travis Kelce or Mark Andrews. And so we had this very precarious spot where people that already had Taysom Hill on their roster as a tight end lucked out because they could start him at tight end and they could also start their normal starting quarterback. You were getting the rare double dip. So since then, while there have been some random weeks where Taysom will have 3 rushing touchdowns, like what was that, 4 or so weeks ago, and he ends up as the highest scoring tight end in fantasy, and I regret that I didn't have him higher. Nothing compares to that year where fans were tweeting at us constantly saying what a bunch of morons we were for not having him at quarterback and not tight end.
Yeah, I actually think he probably should be listed as a running back more than a tight end at this point, especially now that Mark Ingram's out and they didn't make a move and there's really nobody behind him. I think he's going to get even more carries. So I think people are in a little bit of a conundrum there of where to list him for their fantasy
filing that one
leagues.
away for Monday night.
Yeah.
Well, do you think the Saints, and Nick had a good piece on it this year, do you think they've, I mean, at times Taysom Hill's been almost a joke in NFL circles. Do you think they finally honed in on using him the most effective way?
Yeah, I always thought that the Taysom Hill rhetoric got a little bit out of control, right? Sean Payton, one of the best offensive minds ever, really liked Taysom Hill. Like, big deal, right? And I know that week in and week out, like I don't mean big deal like taking away what Sean thinks. I mean like big deal that like they like him a lot. And by the way, he's making $10 million a year. Like, what's that around the NFL these days? That's like an average wide receiver, below average probably, right? I mean, these guys are making $30 million a year. I know that this is the kind of thing that does not necessarily light the world on fire for fans, but there are games in which Taysom Hill is going to have very little impact on the box score. But every single week, every team that the Saints play is going to spend a lot of time preparing for the possibility of Taysom Hill being on the field at quarterback, running back, perhaps catching passes, perhaps playing, personal protector on the punt team. Who knows, right? I mean, the guy's done pretty much everything for the Saints. So I know that it has people up in arms often, the infatuation that Sean seemed to have, and to a degree the team still does have. But I actually think this year feels to me like perhaps the most impactful Taysom Hill season to date. I don't know if that's just statistically, but also in the intangibles department. So I would say like I never got that fired up about how the Saints did or didn't utilize him. I think he is a really unique player. Valuing that player from a contract is tricky because of the chance that he did become a quarterback. And I think this year he's presented some real problems for opposing defenses.
Well, you work for ESPN and we have you on a Monday Night Football week. So let me ask you about this game in particular. How do you handicap Saints Ravens?
Yeah, this is a fun one because the Saints obviously showed us something last week that I don't know that everybody was expecting. Not that they couldn't beat the Raiders, but they could beat the Raiders with Devontae Adams having 1 catch for 3 yards and the Saints not allowing a single point. And I'm sure I'm speaking like many coming into the season. I would have expected that the Saints sort of bread and butter would be their defense, which on paper looked to be maybe not quite at the same level as last year because some of the departures, but certainly not that far either. Not that far off either because you retained a lot of the really essential ingredients. An all-pro cornerback and Marshawn Lattimore and, the heart and soul of the defense. And I would think to Mario Davis that would be my characterization of him as the heart and soul. And Cam Jordan, who's the ageless wonder up front, who seems to just somehow defy the fact that pass rushers are not supposed to be good in their 30s, and he's just continually awesome. And yet that obviously has not been the case through the first, 6 games. It was the team that was sort of held back by the defense. And so the tenor of the season seems to have changed, at least to my estimation, over the past, however, it's been 15 days from right now, from when they played against Arizona and lost that game. All of a sudden, it's like they're a game out in the division and the defense got back on track. I assume the secondary is going to get healthier as the season goes along, even with Bradley Roby recently being placed on IR, that maybe this team can be frisky enough to win the division and then make life hard. Because while there's one team that I think is really, really good in the NFC and the Philadelphia Eagles, I think besides that, the conference is way wide open. So that does not answer the question for Monday night. Baltimore is very good. Obviously, they're 5-3 atop the division, and they have one of the most unique players the league has ever seen in Lamar Jackson. But this is a team that's had some vulnerabilities itself. Specifically, they have not been able to solve the passing game. They've had some notable breakdowns. It's been better of late, but at the beginning of the season, teams were routinely putting up big numbers and big plays against the Ravens. They're always well coached. They've always got plenty of playmakers on both sides of the ball. But I think this is a game that the Saints can win, especially if the crowd is what I expect it to be, because Monday Night Football in New Orleans has to be one of the, I don't know, 3 or 5 most special atmospheres in all of football.
I was going to ask you about the NFC South, but you just kind of hit on that one with just kind of how wide open it is. So the big news here right now, Mike Thomas was just placed on IR, obviously, and he has this huge contract, $28 million cap hit next year, base salary of $15.5 million. If you are a GM, how do you handle that given how long it's been since you've seen him healthy and how much he is going to cost against their cap?
Yeah, this one feels to me, and I don't have any. I'm not saying I've gotten this answer from somebody, but it strikes me just looking at it reasonably, like this is headed for a post June 1 designation, right? It's just the easiest way to absorb that dead cap hit over multiple years, the only way I should say. And while Mike looked sort of like vintage Mike at the beginning of this season, I hate to quote the old Bill Parcells saying too much, but your best ability is your availability. And we're talking about, was it 40 games missed over the past 3 seasons for Mike? Obviously, all of last year, the rest of this season. So it's a bummer. I was sort of a Mike Thomas apologist. I just thought that like the slant boy stuff never did anything for me. I thought that some of that was just fans grabbing low hanging fruit. And I'm not sure why people feel the need to try to chop others down, especially those that are at the top of the mountain. But that's kind of the way the world works, I guess, now with social media. But it seems to me like the most palatable option for the Saints, as far as the cap is concerned, is probably go with that, to split, to go with the post June 1 designation and take the hit over 2 years. But I just think bringing him back, there's such a significant injury risk involved that it's not like it's a small number. You're bringing him back at a big number. And the Saints have found their way out of plenty of cap constraints in the past. So if that's the way that they go, they'll still find a way to keep a lot of the guys that they want to keep.
Yeah, the slant boy stuff was always crazy to me because he was about to slant his way into the Hall of Fame. Just
149 catches. Like, it's one thing if this was some like college player who, goes to the NFL and has like zero production. It's like, yeah, he basically was just winning because he played in the Big 12 and like, there was no defense. Like, it just, I don't know, man. I've seen this, I see it. I think we all see it every day. Right. But, just because you don't run a 4.25 40 doesn't mean that you're not an incredible wide receiver who's got precise route running and great hands and is physical and was good after the catch and all the things that I think we saw from Mike T, especially during that 2019 season, which was one of the most special in terms of recent NFL lore.
Do you see him possibly having any trade value? Do you think someone would maybe possibly trade for him? And I don't know, maybe he sits on your roster until June 2nd and you execute that trade?
My guess would be only if there's some sort of financial, the Saints are willing to eat some of the money there, just because we were talking about this a lot this week. Brandon Cooks is a guy who teams kept saying the big reason why they're not willing to trade for him is $18 million next offseason, fully guaranteed. And, Cook's is a good player, right? He's not like he's not whatever, Tyreek Hill, but he's also not average, right? He's a good, solid potential number 2 wide receiver, maybe a number 1 in a certain offense. And if Brandon Cooks can't be moved at that number, I just think Mike probably would have to be at a lower number, or a number that's reduced by the Saints chopping away at some of that money, whether it's eating a signing bonus, however they work it. Of course, there are a million different ways for Kai to make that work. But my general sense is that it would be hard for other teams to just trade for him straight up as the contract is currently constructed.
You just referenced Kai Harley.
Yeah.
As someone who follows the front office, closer than I think most NFL analysts do, and come from that background, you know what the Saints' reputation has been. I mean, speaking of things that were kind of a joke around the league, the way they kind of borrow against the future credit cards and max out everything and trade away all their draft picks and future spending, but yet it's 16 straight years now of 7-win seasons that, from 4 straight division titles from 2017 on. What did you think of that perception when they were the only team doing it? And do you think sort of the national perception has changed over how they manage the cap when we've seen other teams like the Rams and the Buccaneers sort of do this all in to win and win Super Bowls?
Yeah, totally. I have a few thoughts here. Is first of all, like, my belief in terms of how you should manage the cap is that whatever your approach is, you are consistent with that approach. And if you're going to go with the Saints approach of perpetually pushing money forward and allowing yourself to be more aggressive in the present year, where it gets complicated is if there ever comes a time when it's not Kai Harley and Mickey Loomis atop the organization, and if they hire somebody who has a totally fundamentally different approach to the cap, who wants to keep things more flat and neutral, then there will be a transition period where you're going to have to cut really good players or trade really good players, and you won't be able to replace them as adequately as the Saints have. I don't know why. Again, maybe I'm singing to the wrong audience here, but I don't know why people are so up in arms about the Saints cap approach. I will say that observers around the NFL, including fellow cap people, have expressed to me in the past that there have been maneuvers that have been super creative and things that even they hadn't thought about. And, if you're a cap analyst for a team, like, a lot of your job is finding out ways to win around the margins. And the Saints have always done a really good job with that. The base salary to signing bonus conversion is fairly straightforward now. It's done by almost every team around the NFL. Some teams do it only when needed. Others, like you mentioned, Tampa and Los Angeles and the Eagles, and a few others do it because like basically across the board. But there have been some things like, I remember late last year when I think it was a Marshawn Lattimore likely to be earned all-pro incentive that they converted into a roster bonus for this upcoming league year. And the reason why was that it gave them $500,000 in cap space for 2021. And Marshawn wasn't going to get the incentive. He either wasn't going to get it at all because he wasn't going to be named All-Pro, or wasn't going to get it until like March 15th. So they said, here's a roster bonus for $500,000 next year. And you're going to end up making the same amount of money. As a matter of fact, we're guaranteeing it for you. So I've always felt like their approach has been extremely creative. They've been, I would argue, as resourceful as really any team. And how many cap guys are known? Like, how many cap guys are known by name? Like the fact that Kai is even on a one name basis is just like, yeah, there goes Kai doing Kai things again. I think speaks to probably how their approach is perceived and how effective it is.
Yeah, you mentioned Howie Roseman, and he's probably been number 2 right alongside the Saints.
I'd
he's
say
the most
so.
celebrated guy in the NFL right now. Well, what did you think, though, about their decision to keep doing it this year? No more Drew, no more Sean Payton. They didn't go crazy in free agency, but they did sign Tyrann Mathieu and Jarvis Landry and then traded for that extra first-round pick. What did you think about continuing to try to compete for a title this year the way they did?
I was on board with it. Like, I think, and I don't know, like, it would have to be, maybe it's, I don't know about a responsibility, but I do think with some of these guys that are still on the roster and playing at a high level at a veteran stage of their career, like, you kind of have to, like, what are you doing? If you're going to continue to have a Cam Jordan and Demario Davis, who you extended, was it late last season? I remember it was one of those that like got dropped in the middle of a Fox game, right? Wasn't it Bucks Saints in New Orleans where I think it was Aaron Andrews halftime was like, yeah, I was talking to Mario Davis, told me he got an extension last night. And it was like, wait, what? Like, how often do those kind of deals fly under the radar? Anyways, I think you owe it to players. Like, when you still have some gas left in that tank, I think you kind of have to be consistent with it. And oh, by the way, I know that it's perceived as an approach that you take because you have players that are either in their prime or nearing the end of the prime and you want to kind of keep things going. But look at Philadelphia as a good example. Like, that's a team that's got a quarterback drafted in the second round on a rookie deal, a bunch of really good young players, and like, they're constantly kicking the can on like guys that they extended like a year ago, right? Like, whether it's a Dallas Goedert or an AJ Brown or a Darius Slay, like, we're not talking about guys in their mid 30s that they are pushing money ahead on, that they're going to eventually just sort of absorb the pain. So I kind of think that, again, as long as you're doing it in perpetuity, I think it's the right approach. Eventually someone may come in and change how they go about it for the Saints. But my belief is that, like, be consistent because it keeps you afloat. And the personnel department's had some attrition, excuse me, but for the most part, it's a lot of the central figures that have allowed them to build the sustainable model.
So you keep going even after this year, as long as they have some of these core players. Like, you're saying basically this should be the approach forever until there's just nowhere left to kick.
So my feeling would be that until somebody comes in and has a different view of how the cap should be managed, that's how I would do it. And maybe I'm way off here. Like, is that is that not the general tenor that people feel down there? Is that how
Yeah,
do you guys feel differently? Does Saints Twitter feel dramatically differently?
I think that it's kind of come to a point where people are looking at it like, is it worth it because the core players are old and then maybe the future isn't as bright? Personally, I kind of agree with you that I think that you can just keep doing this forever and there's really no reason to stop. There's really no punishment. Internally, I know that there's kind of an idea of like, let's try to clean it up a little bit, but I don't think that they'd ever say, you know what, like we're just not going to be competitive for the next 2 or 3 years while all this dead money clears and all that. But I think that there's maybe a little bit of like, we're gonna press down on the gas and maybe go 120 instead of trying to see like, hey, can this thing hit 180?
Sure, that's fair. And maybe there is a way to thread the needle a little bit. And I felt like there were a couple of contracts, and now that I'm here on the spot, I should have them handy this year where I was like, you know what? Actually, here's one. And you guys may know better. Maybe isn't the Tyron contract structured in a way that is not like, am I wrong here? That thinking his base salary is not like 1.035 million bucks. Isn't it higher this year?
Yeah, they did a couple things this year that were a little bit more responsible, and there was a little bit more bargain shopping, and that really was kind of when we talked to Mickey Loomis at the combine, like his idea was that like, hey, we're going to remain competitive. We think we have a good team. Don't know if there's a Super Bowl window this year, so we're going to try to make the playoffs and see what happens when we get there. But it's not going to be like in 18-19 where it was just putting every single chip into it. But then they get to the draft and they trade up their future draft assets to help this current team, and then they sign Tyron, and then they bring in Jarvis. So it kind of feels a little bit conflicting, and I think that aggressive nature is just going to kind of always be inherent to this team as long as Mickey's around.
So here's what I'll say is that it's funny that this conversation that we're having, and I know this is going to be out on Monday, comes on the heels of the Eagles winning, going to 8-0, because in following the NFL trade deadline, there were a couple of moves where people made comments to the effect of like, oh my God, I can't believe they paid this much for that guy. And I always, my retort is usually the same. Every NFL team would love to draft a fourth round wide receiver who turns into an absolute superstar. And then you extend him 3 years into his rookie deal. And because he was drafted in the fourth round, he's willing to do business early. This would be the Stephon Diggs model for the Vikings, right? A fifth round pick, actually. And when they first extended him, it was for $14 million per year, which I know that we're several years removed from that, but even at the time was a discount. That's great. We'd all love to do that. You know what? More oftentimes than not, you find good players in the draft in the first round. And then when you have really good players, they end up getting deals that are at the top of the market as opposed to in the middle of the market. So I also admire teams that are like willing to be aggressive and go do it. We are far too, and I understand why, but we are far too reliant upon Super Bowl wins as the determining factor as to whether things are worth it or not. There have been 55 teams that have won the Super Bowl in the history of this great league. There's only 55 teams in some people's minds that have done things the right way. So I don't mind I would disagree with that. Like, I think there is something to be said for a successful model that carries itself over and over and over again. And in the same way that while it is in some ways irresponsible to trade 4 draft picks for a running back, I sort of look at the 49ers right now trading with Carolina for Christian McCaffrey and say, I feel a lot better about them than I did a month ago. Right. And I may in March be like, oh my God, they've got like 2 picks in the entire draft. What the hell were they thinking? But I oftentimes do think that we are so fixated on how can we achieve maximum success without ever having to pay the appropriate price to reach that success, because like Philadelphia is a good example. Right now, a lot of the things that they have done have worked out, and a lot of things that they have done have not been for maximum price, right? You got a quarterback who's making like $2 million this year, who's in the MVP conversation.
Yeah, I don't know if I gave you bad info, but we manage our podcast like the Saints manage the cap. This thing is coming out in like an hour on Friday, so your reference there is going to be relevant before the weekend.
We'll retweet it on Monday.
Yeah,
oh
sure,
yeah,
sure.
we'll get mileage out of
it.
We'll extend you on Monday.
One of the things too, well, we got you talking with the GM hat on. The big question here really is if Sean Payton does decide to coach and they do trade him, what do you think he could actually bring back in terms of draft compensation?
Well, here's my party line. If I'm Mickey Loomis, is first round pick. That's where the conversation starts. There have not been a ton of head coaching trades in the NFL, and it's a different era compared to when the two most notable in the last 20 or 25 years, obviously Bill Belichick and John Gruden. Belichick went for a first. I think Gruden went for 2 firsts, right? That was 2 firsts going from Tampa, from Oakland then to Tampa, and both of those. I'm sorry, Gruden was going from Tampa back to Oakland. He's had a lot of different stops along the way. So whatever it was, but the Patriots don't have any regrets about that. I don't think that the Bucks and Raiders have any regrets about that trade either. The difference now compared to then is that patience has completely run dry amongst ownership. And if you are, and I'm just making this up because it's the only vacancy at the moment, the Panthers, and you're David Tepper, and your GM says, "Hey, I want to hire Sean Payton. We have to give up the 6th pick in the draft." David Tepper is saying, "Who's playing quarterback for us?" Like, Sean's got an arm, but Sean's in his early 50s now. I don't think Sean's going to be able to hack it. And that's a really tricky, it's a fine line for an acquiring team to have to balance, is that most teams that make coaching changes are bad. First round picks are near the top of the order. And that alone makes it a tricky thing for them to navigate. So I would want a first round pick. I'd also think that Sean has the gift of leverage that he doesn't have to take the first job that comes his way, right?
Right. While
While I think he could well be back in 2023, like, if you told me that 4 jobs opened up and they were all kind of and Sean's like, "No, I'm good," right? Like, I kind of like TV. He's got family. He's probably spending more time with his kids than he has in the past. I don't know if he's a golfer, right? A little bit of a golfer, like golf, travel, drink some beers, do whatever you want, right? Enjoy being one of the greatest coaches of the past 25 years. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if he decides to take, I don't know, obviously, but he has the ability to be selective. And I think that impacts the process as well here.
Well, it's funny you left out the Bruce Arians trade from Arizona to Tampa, because I think it was like a 5th round pick. He had been like in retirement or whatever. But it's funny because that's the other end of the scale that we never talk about. Sean being retired put such a wild card into this. There might come a point where the Saints, like if a team said, "All we'll give you is a 3rd round pick," the Saints might have to decide, will we take the 3rd round pick or will we tell Sean, "Sorry, you're not allowed to coach"? I mean, might come down to what is. But it's funny that we mentioned Bruce Arians, because he's not getting talked about nearly as much as Sean Payton, at least obviously from what we hear. But that team's crumbled without him. But obviously the one we get here is how much the Saints have missed Sean Payton. What's the national perception of Dennis Allen, do you think, when he was hired, the decision they made, and now that they've gotten off to a slow start?
I think from the beginning, it seemed like Dennis was going to get that job. I don't think there was any real surprise that he ended up being hired to replace Sean. I think that Dennis, obviously, the success he had as a defensive coordinator spoke for itself. And I've always believed that the process of hiring and then evaluating head coaching hires is sort of feeble. Like, the responsibilities of a head coach are not to just be a coordinator. Like, and yet when we go to, whenever we get to this offseason, whenever we get to the 4 or 5 or 6 head coaching vacancies, we're going to say, "Oh, wow, well, the Eagles were really good on offense this year. Maybe Shane Steichen should be the next head coach," or whoever it was, right? Whoever is the hot, the D'Amico Ryans is the coordinator for the top ranked defense for the 49ers. All right, he should be, the head coaching candidate, which, by the way, both those guys could be great. I happen to think D'Amico is going to be a really good head coach at some point. I don't know as much about Shane personally, but it's sort of a flawed process. That being said, I think Dennis, Nick has sent along sort of where we might go. So I did take some time to sort of just sort of gauge some interest around the league about what their perceptions are on top of my own perceptions. And I'm not trying to make excuses, but when your quarterback gets hurt, 3 games into the season, and he was already banged up coming into the season, when your number 1 wide receiver gets banged, well, not anymore, but the player that you thought was going to be your alpha wide receiver gets hurt, your veteran wide receiver gets hurt, your 1st round pick at left tackle gets hurt. Like, the Saints have had one of the more difficult injury situations in the league so far this season. So it's not like this is probably the vision of the roster that I think DA had coming into this season. And there have been a couple of games that have been like inexplicable, and there have been some things. I know turnovers have been nauseating for fans this year, and I don't know how much of that is always coaching versus how much of that is just the players and execution. I think it's been okay. I'm far from, and I think that the general, I would say the average answer is that like they've been fairly snake bitten with the injury bug. It obviously hasn't been great. There do seem to be some ways in which they miss Sean, but no one that I reached out to felt like this guy's in over his head, or this is the same Dennis Allen who obviously had some, forgettable years during his time with the Raiders.
And what about Andy Dalton? What's the perception of Andy Dalton? It's so interesting because it looks kind of like we were even comparing how their offense looks like they were running it with Drew Brees in later years when he wasn't throwing the ball downfield as much. Certainly what Teddy Bridgewater looked like when he came in, but he's on his 4th team in 4 years. Is the bottom going to drop out at some point, or is this what Andy Dalton can be when he's surrounded by this kind of talent?
Yeah, I think the feeling continues to be, and maybe it's because he's been around, and so these people all have exposure to him, or they've played with or against him enough to have like a good feel for having scouted him. But it's like, again, the average answer is, you guys don't give that guy enough respect. And I'm like, I don't know who you guys are, first of all. But, Andy is, I think they all feel like he is what he is, right? Is that he is like a low ceiling, high floor starting quarterback for you. I know that I mentioned turnovers. It's not like Andy is not responsible for some of those on his own, but that good enough to help you stay competitive within some games. He's going to know exactly what he's supposed to do. And that is a trait that I always tell fans. Coaches want quarterbacks that can execute what they are asking them to do. Some of them can do it at an A+ level. Some of them can only do it at a B- level. But you would take a quarterback that knows what you are looking to do and can execute it consistently over a guy who one play might throw it 75 yards for a touchdown, and on the next play might throw the ball backwards into an opposing defender's lap for a touchdown going the other way. So I think Andy is kind of settling into where he belongs, is that never going to carry you, but good enough that if the pieces around him do their job, and if he allows them to do their job, like he has with Alvin as a good example over the past 4 games, you're going to stay in a lot of the games, especially with the way that this division is constructed this year.
Yeah, it's crazy because Jameis's tenure as a starting quarterback in the NFL might end because he couldn't throw 5-yard passes to Alvin Kamara consistently. And now Andy might be the starter next year too if they don't find something in the draft. Last one we got
money to make too, right? I mean, Andy's got, I think it's $500K for playing 50% of the snaps, $500K more for making the playoffs, and then I want to say it's like $150 for each playoff win. Bottom line is Andy's making himself some money and perhaps earning himself more opportunity.
Last one we got for you. Who wins the NFC South?
I'm not trying to play to the crowd here, but I keep coming back to the Saints because the Falcons are playing like the narrowest of margin football that I have seen this season. They're 4-4 and they get a ton of credit for it. Up until the first 6 games are the only team that was undefeated against the spread. For those out there that aren't degenerate gamblers, basically like they win the games they're supposed to win, and they play the games that they're supposed to lose bad closer than the experts think, right? But they're so limited offensively. And I don't, they have 2 players that are special in terms of talent that they haven't unleashed in Drake London and Kyle Pitts. So I think it's the Saints or the Bucks. And the Bucks, I have no answer for what's gone on. Key players that are supposed to be great aren't playing great for the Bucks, on both sides of the ball for that matter. It looks joyless on offense right now. It's like tough to watch them. I know you guys you see them twice a year, and it feels like more than that because of the playoff matchups. But it looks joyless right now. So I think the Saints can find a way. If they win on Monday night, I'd feel much better about that estimation. But I think it's the Saints or the Bucks to win.
All right, it's Field Yates on Twitter. You cannot fake the depth of knowledge he just dropped throughout this interview. Minor contract details, knowing everybody on the team. Not many people can do that from a national position. That's why he's the best. Thanks for coming on, man.
Well, I almost wore I have a super sweet Saints like retro jacket from Homage. I almost wore it, and I thought that might be a little too close. Like, you have to be a little more objective, but they are one of the team. I mean, I try to follow all 32 very closely, but I have, and this is a tribute to both of you guys, both during Trips ESPN days, and now obviously the 2 of you together. There's unbelievable coverage of the Saints. I think the beat's probably, I would throw it in the top 3 for sure. And the only reason why I'm saying top 3 and not number 1 is I'd have to think longer about that. But I always feel like as far as as a consumer, like there's very, very little that we are not provided which I think is a tremendous resource for fans, not just in New Orleans, but also those of us that just love football in different parts of the country. So you guys are the best, and I appreciate all you do.
Yeah, we can't be the number one beat as long as Mike Reese still exists somewhere in the world. So wherever
He
he's
kills
at,
it on
that
his
is the
own
number
up there
one.
in New
Yeah.
England, man. He does. But he was, by the way, when I was thinking about top three, I was like, I think I have to put the teams that begin with New Orleans, New England, just because you're right. I mean, it's central figures can carry a lot of weight, and certainly what you guys are doing. It's awesome, and I have a lot of fun interacting with Saints Twitter. And the thing about the Saints is like they never ever are boring, right? There's
Oh, that is the
movement.
truest statement of this whole
Yeah.
conversation.
That's right. So love to see all the success you guys are having, and maybe one day you'll hire me to join the team too.
There's room for another chair in here.
We'll
Yeah, we
keep
can
trying
do
to
that.
grow, man. I appreciate you coming on.
Thanks a lot,
Okay.
Field.
Take care.
Possibly one of the most talented people on TV. Great host, great podcast host, great fantasy analyst, great football analyst, cap guru. Man does literally everything. So make sure you're checking out all his work. Monday night, Saints are playing Baltimore. What do you think they have to do to win this game? Like, what is the one thing that you're looking at and saying, all right, this team's got hot. If they can do this, they can win this game.
Well, it's obviously stop Lamar Jackson, which would be true of, you know, anybody talking about any team that's about to play the Ravens, but especially the Saints, because even when their defense was hot in recent years, they've been torn up by Jalen Hurts. They've been torn up by Marcus Mariota and Cordero Patterson, and in those cases, it's being torn up by the quarterback who can run and the running back alongside him because your run defense is stretched so thin that you have to have gap integrity, as Dennis Allen explained this week, everywhere across the board. And that, unfortunately, is something the Saints have really struggled with this season. They obviously did a better job against the Raiders, but that's the number one thing. I mean, the Ravens themselves are not at peak strength. They're dealing with injuries just as much as the Saints. This is not a team that they cannot beat. Frankly, if the Saints have a ceiling like we saw against the Raiders, there's no team on the schedule they can't beat. But that is obviously the biggest challenge they're going to face against the Raiders.
Yeah, look, they got to tackle well. I mean, I think that's the biggest thing here. And there were some issues with that last week, but they did a better job of bringing the party to those situations. Someone would miss a tackle, someone would be there to clean it up. When they were a good team, they still missed a lot of tackles on defense, but it was the buddy system. And you got the buddy there, bad things can happen and someone cleans it up and it's not a big deal. So if you have this swarming mentality, and I think it's going to be huge this week, they can overcome that. The other thing, I think being without Marshawn Lattimore, no Bateman playing in this game. Even if he was, I think if you have to be without your world-class cornerback that kind of is at the core of your defensive identity, this is maybe a game where you're okay with it. Other guys got to play well. They got to disrupt that timing. And number three for me is to your main point, bringing in Brett Hundley's interesting to me. Like they have not been good against this type of quarterback. That says to me, okay, look, we need to do something different. We can't keep doing what we're doing. We need better looks in practice. Maybe he provides that, maybe he doesn't, but it's at least a change and a recognition that they can't stop this type of player. So we're kind of up against it here. We got practice starting in a couple of minutes. The last thing I want to ask you, I'm just going to ask you what I asked Field. NFC South, can they win it?
That's a Tampa Bay question for me, and I can't answer enough about Tampa Bay. I think the Saints can get to 8-9. I think that's a realistic target for this team, is that they can be an 8-9 team. I don't know if that's good enough to win the division because if Tampa Bay ever figures it out, I think they can get to 9 or more wins. But the Tampa Bay that I've seen in recent weeks doesn't look like they're going to get there. So absolutely, it's realistic. If they beat Atlanta again the next time they play them and sweep them, 8-9 could potentially win this division. So to me, it depends on if Tampa Bay ever figures it out.
I think they can. I feel it. Like I feel like they're gonna get healthy and they get the cavalry back, and I feel like they've turned the corner. Now, when we come back here and do next,
Yeah. Well, that's the thing.
podcast,
You just asked me what's the number one thing about the Ravens, and that threw me for a loop because I almost forgot who they were playing. With the Saints, it's about the Saints. Which Saints team shows up? Not what their ceiling can be. Can they find consistency? It's been their most elusive commodity this
I'll
year.
put it this way: if they win Monday night, I'm going to say yeah, they win. And I just kind of feel like that's where this division is. Some team wins a couple games in a row, they get on a run, and off they go. Because I don't think any of them can really have sustained success. I think the Saints are going to be, even if they make it to the title, it's going to be 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and it's just going to be kind of like a stop and go thing. It's just a matter of putting those 2 steps together. So if they win Monday night, let me edit that. If they win Monday night, I'm going to say they win the division. And if they lose, I don't know if it drastically changes anything because everybody else might lose on Sunday and they might be in a perfectly fine situation. But that's all we got for you guys this week. Make sure you check us out, NewOrleans.Football/subscribe. Get on the site. Best way to support us if you like the show. That keeps the lights on here, and we got better lights, so we need to keep those on for sure. Extra podcasts every week, our news and analysis, and for all your coverage throughout the week, keep it locked.